Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Development Discourse, where we ideate for Africa's development. My name is Patrick Okigbo. I'm the founding partner at Nextier. Nextier is a multi-competency advisory firm focused on solving some of Africa's most complex development challenges. And Africa has many of these challenges. Economic growth remains quite constrained for several reasons. To achieve sustainable development, the continent must transition from just producing base materials, producing and exporting base materials, to value-added industrialization and growth of many other sectors of the economy. In this episode of Development Discourse, I'd like to explore how the continent can strengthen its industrial and creative economies and ecosystems. My guest today, Professor Eka Ikpe, is the director of Africa Leadership Center at King's College London. She also co-leads two Africa-Europe clusters of research excellence. One is on creative economies in Africa. The other is on the interdisciplinary peace. She has co-authored or co-edited several books on peace, society, and the state in Africa, African perspectives on peace building and leadership, and creative economies in Africa. She serves as a trustee for the global think tank ODI. She has a BA in economics from Leeds and MSc and PhD in economics from SOAS. Eka, you're welcome.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here, Patrick, and thanks to all those who are here with us. I look forward.
Fantastic. Thank you. So let me start with, my understanding of one of Ha-Joon Chang's papers, where he kind of advocates or says or explains that Africa may have a hard time playing in the fourth industrial revolution, given that we kind of missed the third one. What's your view on this? Should we just turn off the lights and, go home, wherever home is? Or is there a way for us to leapfrog and still play in this fourth industrial revolution?
Thank you very much for that, Patrick. I think that, very important points, very important argument from a scholar I myself admire a great deal, Ha-Joon Chang, who's not far from me here at SOAS. And I think this is a tense issue because the logic is that the moment has gone, and especially if we think of China as the largest manufacturer in the global economy in this moment. So we should pause and move on. But I think you will agree with me that the responses we're seeing from the US around this, around the need to, an economy as advanced, if you like, and not a big fan of those terms, but as advanced as the US, questioning even that logic, a great big US. So on that basis, I think, no, I would argue there is certainly still space for us to have a different conversation about how industrial development might take place. I think industrial development is an imperative for the kind of socioeconomic transformation that many of us crave for on the African continent. There are many avenues towards this, and perhaps he's right in that how this has been done in the past by economies on a singular basis. Maybe the time for that, we're going to face challenges around that. Part of what's linked to a position like that is the place that global value chains, global production networks have come to play, where it becomes more and more difficult for a single country to produce across the entirety of value chain. So there are many arguments, China, this point about value chains that perhaps lay credence to the point that you made earlier on. For us to see this transformation, we need to be thinking about how we use science and technology in particular ways. We need to be thinking about how we're producing goods that generate a higher and more stable price in the global economy. And perhaps for me in this moment, what is most critical is we need to also be thinking about how we produce the kind of goods that we need. In a place like Nigeria, and I'm Nigerian and it's a space I'm very familiar with, but on the African continent as well. So that argument has been made, but we know, for example, that So I don't know if you know of these special economic zones or economic development zones that often are associated with China. Not, we often say owned, but not necessarily. Like the one in Lagos, actually, Lagos State has a huge equity within that, so they're far more complex arrangements. We know that many of these zones, they're supposed to be in place on the African continent to address production of some manufactured goods for export. But actually, we're seeing that a lot of them are very interested in the domestic market. They're looking to produce, export some, but also very interested in a dynamic domestic market that, unfortunately, on the continent, we tend to dismiss. Some work I've done looking at now Ethiopia, for example, that had a very, I think, forward-looking agenda to think about the transformation of hides and skin to leather goods, right? Very driven by, the leadership at the time. What has been also termed a sort of developmental state approach was very clear that they're going to have a situation where they're not simply exporting hides and skin. What they did was increase the tariff rates to make it nearly impossible to export those hides and skin in their raw form. The interest was rather in forcing or compelling actors in the space to think through, or making it, I guess, more economically viable for them to pivot to producing finished goods in Ethiopia. What was curious, though, was a lot of the attention was on exporting those goods beyond Ethiopia. Never mind the fact that it has quite a large market, if you think in terms of population. It also has a vibrant history thinking about leather goods. Addis Ababa is a huge center for that. But actually, in the policy documents, the idea was actually we're looking at exports. And why is that? That is because of African economies' over-reliance on the need to generate foreign exchange. That says to us, actually, good development means you should not care for your domestic economy. And that's very linked to coloniality. That's because the way we've been inserted in the global economy as part of colonization processes has been to not think about our domestic markets, but to think about the export, especially of what you said earlier, of crude raw materials. So if indeed we don't need to think about industrial development and we should look to other avenues, in a sense, that's what many countries have been doing. Because our industrial production levels are not not in the spaces we would like to see them at. This remains the key element. If you look at economies across the world, the key way of driving that socioeconomic transformation. So I think we need to pay attention absolutely to this space, but think in new ways around this. So the African Continental Free Trade Area that tells us something about another kind of market we should pay attention to becomes quite important. Accompanying that, of course, is a new but hugely innovative payment and settlement system that enables trade in domestic currencies. So in some ways allows us to think of more valuable currencies. But let me pause there for you.
So what you're saying in a nutshell is maybe we need to rethink the way we think about economic policy, industrialization policy, etc. Maybe the focus on external markets, making foreign exchange, maybe that's part of why we haven't quite developed. That if we looked inwards at the massive economy we have in Africa, so for instance, 1.5 billion people, growing to maybe 2.5 billion in another 2 decades. The size of the economy today is about 1.3 trillion and could grow to about 30 trillion or 29 trillion or something like that in another 2.5 decades. That maybe if we focused more on that, we could drive more innovation, we could drive more of our production. If that's the argument, what's holding us back?
Yeah, so yeah, I would say that, of course, I don't mean we would pivot and ignore the global market, no, but that we have a huge opportunity we are not engaging with in the sort of critical way we should be doing that. What's holding that back? It's a very important question because this has been a long-standing agenda. I mean, let me note that actually trading on the African continent, yes, we have the AfCFTA today and we're very excited about that, but it has been a long-standing ambition for Africa from independence, because there's a recognition, especially by the founding, our ancestors, if you like, for independent Africa, that the only way we would be able to sort of survive this global economy would be to do so collectively. It is the reason why we saw the African Development Bank established. In fact, the African Development Bank you have today and the one that was established are very different. If you look back to that history, it was established to think about how Africa as a space could negotiate access to finance that tended to be global finance that's held by hegemonic powers. You had a situation where the African Development Bank itself did not allow membership. Now, pause with that. Did not allow membership to countries outside of the African continent. It was a liberatory agenda. So development was very linked to a question of liberation and the recognition that we must take ourselves seriously. We must value ourselves in all kinds of ways, including as markets. So some of the challenge and the Lagos Plan of Action, a whole heap of documents that have gone into this in great detail. That some of the challenges we face are, for one, enduring relationships with that global market that place us in a sort of recipient position of manufactured goods and exporting. So we're, in a sense, stuck in that pattern. Today, I think about 70% of African economies are commodity dependent. Exactly. If you look at that map, about 70% of them. So it's not so easy to pivot. The other element, of course, is the kind of infrastructure that enable the kind of trade we would like to see. So this is moving beyond the production issue. Trade facilitation, policy set. So we're supposed to have free trade areas, but we know that the movement of those goods is not always smooth and straightforward. We also know this question about, currency, right? Is it more valuable for me to trade here with colleagues or go and see where I can access, foreign exchange? Even though we know trade within regions, for example, is of a higher value because we don't trade commodities to each other. We have to trade goods we will actually need and we will actually use. So we do see that, but very, very high cost of trade within the continent. And there's a lot of work going on around air travel, movement of people, movement of goods, very, very challenging, very difficult. But I think the underlying issue is actually manufacturing itself, right? That is a trade issue, but manufacturing itself. Huge challenges, and many, if you're beaming into this from a space like Nigeria, huge, huge costs. Think of energy costs, for example, that make it very difficult to be competitive. I did some work looking at the work of the Jubilee syringe factory in my home state, Akwa Ibom. Really fascinating work was going on there, where they were using polypropylene, which is waste, well, not waste, but an output from the petroleum economy. And they were repurposing this, redeploying this to produce syringes for use in Nigeria. At some point, I remember my brother calling me and telling me he was using made in Nigeria syringes in a hospital in Lagos. It was amazing, a point of celebration. There's a lot of policy around enabling this. But when I spoke to them about the costs, the energy costs they were facing, I mean, I think now they're actually in a bit of trouble. I'm not sure if they're still viable, but the energy costs were astronomical. And this is an Akwa Ibom state that isn't very far from River State, where there are gas resources. And it might have been possible to think of energy use through piping gas into this space to be able to do that. We sit on enormous gas resources. We shouldn't be having these conversations. And I think this points back to that question around this outward facing versus more articulated economies, which is what the political economist Claude Ake speaks to as one of the hugest challenge around development for us. Because if we think of energy, not simply as what petroleum we export and generate foreign exchange, how can we be major petroleum exporters? And we are one of the most energy insecure spaces globally. Unfortunately, we see this move into conversations about energy transitions and clean energy, where we talk about exporting lithium and all of this. And we're not talking about actually what does that mean for the batteries we could produce to power the solar energy, which many Nigerians are using, for instance. So I think energy is a huge challenge. I mentioned transportation. Finance is another huge problem. We hosted at our Africa Week, I think a couple of weeks ago, President Ben Orama, who was speaking about the significance and importance of development finance, as opposed to what happens with commercial banks. That, we need what is termed patient capital, the kind of capital that allows for trial and error, that allows for sunk costs. The US, you celebrate tech giants, pharma giants, but a lot of that is supported by state capital. The work of Mariana Mazzucato reflects on that, because those areas, those spaces of innovation require heavy, heavy sunk investments. We hear about the successes, but there are a lot of failures. that accompany some of that. And I'm pleased to see that because of what happened in the COVID period, some funds from the Nigerian government, I think the TED Fund, supported work, I can't remember which universities in Nigeria, the development of a candidate for a COVID vaccine. And this shows the importance of that kind of investment into development finance. It's quite funny that a lot of the financial exchanges, if you like, we have with China, that we've come to rely on in particular ways, comes from their own systems and structures of development finance, right? Exactly. Not purely commercial. So this form of finance, absolutely critical. It's been critical to China, East Asian economies. It's hugely critical. So that finance that deals with the real economy, not speculative finance, I think is absolutely critical. The other things I could note, but I don't know if I'm dwelling too much on this. Let me see if you want to come back to me on any of that.
Sure. And so as you speak, I'm thinking about leadership. I'm thinking about the nature and the character of the leadership that's driving these economies across Africa. I mean, if you look at the decade of the 60s, if you think of that as the independence, or the post-independence decade, Africa on average was growing at about 5 to 6%. And then we got to somewhere around the 1980s. Think of it like the last decade, we were down to 1 to 2%. With the whole Renaissance mantra and democratization, we picked up again to like 3 to 4% in the 2000s. But right now, it seems like we're back in the lost decade again. And when I think about this yo-yoing, and I think about the spots when we had the post-independence mantra, then you have the Thabo Mbekis and the Obasanjos, pushing democracy. I'm not by any stretch saying that they're Democrats. They were pushing democracy, and we saw that growth. What's happening today? So do we say that this is really a reflection of the leadership we have? How are you thinking about these issues? And if yes, are there some thoughts? I know this is not a democracy discussion, but what are some of your thoughts?
No, thank you. I think this is a very, very critical, very important question. As someone who's based at an African Leadership Center, of course, it's something that we are very concerned with. But let me, the first point you spoke about of the post-independence period, which has been very important in my own work. I did that, done some research on this period. And the reason I was drawn to that period was because it offered us a different narrative about the African continent, right? What you hear is a lot of what you're saying. I think that narrative of the lost decade actually has stayed with us. Even when we talk about Africa Rising, it's sort of always treated as, is punctuated by Africa Rising. The loss is punctuated by Africa Rising. Everything good that's happening is sort of accidental. When we revert to the challenge, it's like, oh, we're home again. But that period was one that I encourage everyone to return to that, to just allow an engagement with that period to let you understand what is possible on the African continent. These were not people from another planet. These were folks on our continent. So not to sound airy-fairy, I think there's something about the promise of that period. It came after independence. Those who had fought for independence had a vision for their continent. They understood. And these are people that have been all over the world. If you think of those who struggled for independence on our continent and took over, these are folks that met each other in parts of Europe, in parts of North America, interactions with civil rights movements. So there was something galvanizing. It's interesting you mentioned that period, and you mentioned Thabo Mbeki and that group as well. So there's something about the collective. There's something about the cohort. There is something about recognizing that this is more than one country that I would like to, and this draws me back to, I don't think any kind of, especially not in this period, massive transformation will be possible if we're thinking of African countries working by themselves towards that end. I think we will have to discipline ourselves to think more about the collective, especially as we come to, it's no longer about global north, but also about complex relationship with other global south actors. I think that visioning, that recognition that on the African continent, there is something to offer, there is something of value. And that articulation, that Africa is important. I think in many cases, even we ourselves treat it as a source of raw materials. We treat it as a space where I can get an inexpensive education and go somewhere else to really thrive. And I say this as someone in the diaspora sitting at King's as well, but I hope working in ways that really center my continent. But it's true, I think we all have to hold ourselves accountable. We treat it as a place to take from and not to return to. We treat it as though we have another home. And many of us, in a sense, probably do. It's a space where you have those in power who hold several passports. For instance, you have those who run ministries of education whose kids don't go to the universities. I mean, I don't know who's a minister of education right now, but who's, we don't treat that as our own space for growth and for transformation. And in that first period, that was different. For them, this space was a generative space, was a space that was going to transform the world. It was, conversation, a lot is said about how African countries would struggle around South African apartheid. And there's a recognition that actually we're not free until everyone is free. That was practice. And it's not, these were authoritarian regimes as well. I think it's important for us to not romanticize these periods. And I guess this is where my own disciplinary orientation as someone who works more in economic spheres, talking about economic development, even though I political economy and all of that, I can focus on the material, but I think it's important to note some of the complexities that also challenged the gains of those periods. I think the last thing I'll say around this, both in that period and the periods that have come after, there is something that Claude Ake mentions around, so he critiques, so I'm celebrating the post-independence period, but he was very critical of that period. And people like Frantz Fanon have been critical of that period because I guess you see how a leader like Thomas Sankara thought very differently. They thought we were not radical enough in that period. So yes, we should talk about production. We should talk about higher value production, but where do we fit in questions of equity? And this is not about liberal democracy. It's not about, because we've had liberal democracy where there are questions of equity are not at all part of those conversations. Claude Ake said, we can't talk about transformation if we continue systems that are about production by the many for the few. And I don't know the extent to which those movements really centered that logic and that idea, that we cannot continue with, this production for many, by many for the few. And that is something we continue to struggle with. And there's some that have critiqued even this African Continental Free Trade Area. I'm super excited, huge fan. But if it doesn't really deal with some of the challenges we see across our continent about who benefits, so we celebrate a rising middle class, and it's important for us to do that. I think elite groups play critical roles everywhere in the world. We can't come away from that. But if we're not thinking about what it means for the broadest base of the population, and Samir Amin also dwells on this, then these things are stopgaps, and the challenges of capitalist production will always meet us. We will go in these cycles and return to them. I think, yeah.
So I guess this is more a question for the Africa Leadership Center, King's College. So, and I don't know if my thesis is correct or not. If we look at the decade after the independence, or maybe that independence decade, 1970s, there was some kind of a rallying mantra for the leadership at the time. Then fast forward to maybe the 2000s, late 90s to the 2000s, there was also kind of a rallying mantra. Leaders, presidents of certain big countries in Africa could speak the same language. When I think about Africa today, I am hard-pressed to find those people who are meeting, talking, thinking about Africa and how to put it on the stage, especially as the world order is kind of shifting today, right? So at the Africa Leadership Center, how are you thinking about these big questions? And what are some of the things that maybe we should be doing as policy people, as to help navigate our leaders to this point where they begin to talk again and envision what could be possible?
I think you hit, it's a critical point. I'll say that those two periods, it's quite interesting. There is something about timing. There's something about moments, right? Think of post-independence, we'd come out of colonialism. It's a huge moment, and people were galvanized around, there is something huge to do. There's promise. Where we're coming from is terrible. We must do something going forward. You think of the period also the Mbeki, or these points you make, as we're heading into a sort of more Africa rising narrative, we came from a lost decade, a period where the bottom of everything was Africa. Those critiques about what is that aid concept, all these kinds of visions of Africa. That is like, my goodness, exactly. Why do I want to be there? And this again, that, come on, guys, and I think it was termed Renaissance as well, right? This is how we termed it. So there's something about moments, which is where I come to what you said about a shifting global order, or global disorder. And it's poignant that you mentioned this, because of course, here at the center 2 weeks ago, our Africa Week was around this idea of a global disorder and questions of agency. So what are we doing? We know the problems, we know the challenges. It's important to draw our minds and our attentions to those challenges. But it's also important for us to say the things that have, despite these challenges, been moving in particular directions, and call ourselves to that, and challenge ourselves around those things. How are we going to support some of these questions? Why we invite a person like President Orama? I think the work on the payments and settlement system, so one thing is to complain about dollarization. Another thing is to think through, how do we address the subordination of African spaces and other global South spaces in the global finance infrastructure? How do we do that in a concrete way? And I assure you, there are many that would hope this doesn't go in the direction it needs to go. And it's in early stages, but to think that, how are we going to move that forward? I think that's one of the things that one has to think through and drive, and some of the things we do in spotlighting this kind of work that is going on. We hosted Dr. Naledi Pandor, who was driving a sort of South African position, but a position that's shared as well in global conflicts and wars, and how African actors, the voice we should have, our agency in those global situations, that we do have something to say, we have something to offer in those conversations. We had a fantastic Africa Public Square, which is precisely to say, how do we bring people together and ask tough questions? So this Africa Public Square event is where it's a debate format, where the conversation, you bring together these powerhouses, but it's a debate conversation. Nobody can come and ask questions. You have to come and offer something. What will you offer to this? So that in the end, we are gathering ideas about where we want to move forward on many of these issues that we hold dear to us, and where we need to chart a way forward. And when I say solutions, they won't be easy, do this, do that. There will be conversations. We have to be ready to engage in conversation over long periods. We have to be ready to hold ourselves accountable as well. But there's something about cohorts. There's something about convening, about gathering folks. I like how you pitched it, gathering folks to have this hard conversation. It's taken us a long time to get here. It's not going to be immediate to go out. So I think we need to, it's urgent. We shouldn't step away from how urgent it is, but we need to be patient if we want to have long-standing solutions. Maybe the last point I will make there is the focus of the ALC on young people. I've just come out of a meeting where we were in conversations about the way forward, young people. And young people in not that throwaway, yes, employment is really important. Of course it is. But young people are the majority, vast majority of those on our continent. And in fact, as a result of that, will make us the majority on the globe. This is hugely, hugely important. So it's not, yes, the work, all of those things, but the ideas. And look at the places where there's a dominance of young people. Another area I work on, because of my interest in industrial development and in thinking about the promise of Africa, is creative economies. I don't think I need to say too much about what you see there, what young people teach me about what I said about articulation, valuing ourselves. You see how musicians, how actors, their concern is not foreign markets. Their concern are themselves. Yeah. What conversations are we going to have? Look at the innovation around language, the deployment of certain forms of technology. There's still problems there because of who owns the technologies and where those profits are being gathered. But that is where support should go. Who will own those platforms? We have colleagues working on, space and Africa's space, Africa's agency in some of those contexts. Colleagues at the University of Pretoria are doing that fascinating work. This is where we need to turn our attentions to these spaces that would amplify the vibrance of young people. But we need their ideas in this spot, and we facilitate intergenerational conversations because we all have something to learn. We won't get to this transformation in little silos. We will get to it, as a holistic group, having those challenging each other as well. And so a lot of the work we do is also about convening spaces for this sort of intergenerational conversations, where we think of all of these actors, our elders, but also young people, as equal to the task of this moving us forward. We come respectfully with each other, we challenge each other respectfully as well, but we forge that path forward as a collective as well.
And I'm going to get to discussions on the creative economy, because that's something that fascinates me a lot. And I've seen some of your work, and I'm eager to get to that. But just maybe one more question on the Africa Free Trade Continental Trade Agreement. Your colleague, friend, Carlos Lopez, has done quite a bit of work on markets, and how to interconnect value chains and so on. And the lead for us in Africa is the AfCFTA, right?
Yeah.
What are some of the challenges it's facing with just developing these value chains, or taking a value chains approach to developing markets? Yeah. I don't know if it's something you spend time thinking about, and what are some ideas we can put on the table on how they can resolve these issues?
No, for sure. I think that's a very, very, very important point, because I think it would be nice for us to sit and just think of Africa as Africa and what we need to do. And I wish we would have some time and space to as a continent, just sit with ourselves. But we exist in a world that's very global, and that luxury we don't have. And I guess that's why others have said the idea that you slip away and do what you want, we are constantly going to be jibbed and jibed. And even the AfCFTA, we have to have serious questions about what is it called? The rules of origin, to make sure others don't come and slip in and claim things are African. So there are many complexities, but yet we need that capital, we need the finance, how we will negotiate a lot of that. I think the biggest thing we need to reflect on and think about here are the tensions between a regional agenda and a national agenda, right? Because the way we've thought of industrial policy and driving manufacturing as a way for transformation has been very focused on the national, sort of a methodological nationalism to the way we think of those things. And that kind of competition is an issue. I remember when it was time to sort of sign on to the AfCFTA and ratify, Nigeria had to be convinced. And I think it's important to be honest about some of those tensions. My understanding was that the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria was hesitant because, of course, Nigeria is a huge market. And, value-added manufacturing could be in a better place. So what that means is we are at risk of a place like South Africa, of course, would be super excited about this because they dominate in that space. So there are tensions and there are risks and there are questions around sovereignty. But if we can, I guess, recognize those tensions and think them through, but recognize the benefits and think of this as a process, right? So Nigeria is in there now. How will we make it work for us? Because by ourselves, we're going to struggle. That's the fact of the matter. So think in more integrated ways about industrial policy. That will mean that we also have to think in interdisciplinary ways. We can't think only of the industrial, policy sort of investment in certain sectors without thinking also about the movement of people and what that means. Thinking about forms of technology transfer. Can we take a collective approach to questions of technology transfer? So this gathering of all African countries to China, this summoning, if you like, can we, is there space for a more collective approach there? Would we stand a better chance of negotiating for more around that? So something like technology transfer is critical. It's critical. I mean, all countries in more recent times that have had those kind of transformations have had to draw on technologies that exist, but then build their own on top of that. That can be challenging on a one-to-one basis. As a collective, those are things that could work better. So for me, I think that the key issue we probably have to think through is that tension between the national, which is a valid one, and the continental, because we need to settle that to be able to make this work.
Fantastic. Now to one of my favorite topics, creative economy. So today the market, creative economy market in Africa, maybe about 60 billion. It's estimated to grow to like 200 billion by 2030. But I just feel like that's not even scratching the surface. You look at the youth population, median age 18, 19 across the continent, very dynamic, high energy, very innovative. What's holding us back? Why haven't we dominated, say, for instance, the fashion industry? Yeah. I think Africa still does about maybe 3 or 4% of the global market. What are some of the big element factors? And pick any of the creative economies. It could be food, it could be art, whatever. Use and kind of explain for us why we're not able to just charge to the front of the line.
Great point. I would say we are on a journey that is moving quite swiftly, right? So there's something about the moment where as well that I expect it to look different, but you are right. There are major challenges, especially when you think of this as a global space. If our creatives are facing this and others are not, then that places them at a disadvantage. And let me say, creative economies globally face the kind of challenges where we all enjoy consuming creative goods, but we don't all think we should be paying very much for them. We think, well, they love doing it. They do it for the love. They also have to eat. It's not simply for the love. So my work on fashion, especially I can draw on that space to reflect on this a bit. I think some core challenges that are faced in the fashion industry, one of those would be the kind of materials they need for their work, right? And I think this applies in many spaces. So quality inputs, part of that is linked to our challenge of deindustrialization. We know across the continent, think of West Africa, Kenya, have had really vibrant textile industries, for example, through the 80s until something I haven't mentioned yet. I can't believe I haven't in a conversation like this, structural adjustment programs, which are a huge, I lay all blame, if I can, in higher education. Everywhere I go, I lay a lot of blame at the feet of structural adjustment programs, right? And, those decimated what were really incredible areas of advancement, the kind of work that's done in textiles, both in sort of, if you think of West Africa, what we call, our wax prints, which are probably more commercial, and less so, maybe the heritage spaces have always been sort of smaller cottage industries. And, in engaging with a lot of our fashion designers, this is a huge problem. And you see the tensions they face. On the one hand, it's so interesting speaking to creatives because they understood fully the imperative for saying we need to use domestic inputs, right? Because their process is not simply about the bottom line. There's such a fascinating space to engage with because it challenges sort of capitalist narratives about things. They are about a complete good. They are about both cultural and economic value, which allows us to complicate this focus only on the economic. And part of why I'm looking at this space is broadening my mind as well. So they were interested in inputs, and they also said the inputs that are from the domestic economy, our work looked at Nigeria and Kenya, tend to be of higher quality. The ones from the country will be of higher quality, but those spaces are so decimated that now they are forced to rely, if they're going to be competitive, they're forced to rely on imported goods that are of lower quality, but they've flooded the market so extensively that it's almost impossible to find that. Last year, I went to Balogun, I was with a fashion designer walking through the market. I was hard-pressed to find a stall that sold any fabric. Maybe we found one that sold Nigerian-made fabrics, one. And I was hard-pressed to find any that wasn't selling fabrics made in China. These were, now the Ankara fabrics I have that are made in Nigeria, they are like artifacts. I keep them very carefully because it's so rare to find any of those anymore. This is a huge issue. Yet they're also unhappy about the sort of knee-jerk industrial policies that ban those fabrics entirely. They understand the impetus, but they say if you ban them entirely and you're not also facilitating domestic production, you just leave us in a very difficult place, having to pay much higher for inputs, and we're not able to compete. Another key one is one I've mentioned before, finance. And what was interesting is, okay, access to finance is generally an issue because of the speculative nature of finance, as opposed to finance that is trying to support real economic activities like manufacturing, like agriculture. Many of us know how this occurs. In Nigeria, I can speak of certainly, but also some of them noted there is finance actually available, but that finance is not structured in ways that speaks to the needs of creatives. So very complicated processes for accessing that finance, the information not flowing as it should. There's another point that was made, but also a financial instrument that is available for 2 years. And they're like, well, how will I will never be able to pay this back in 2 years. We're having a lot of our conversations also during COVID. And it's like their point was that these are financial instruments where you can see, well, it feels as though those who put those instruments together were not thinking about creative economies, right? So those are, I mean, there are many, education was another one. So having those that can support this work at all levels, right? They love engaging with their colleagues that are sort of in the artisan spaces, and not purely education. I think the kind of exchange that smooths out that relationship was very key. Thinking about production facilities was something that came up, and thinking about how they could work collectively, because they tend to be quite small. Doing this work by themselves individually was not seen as the most efficient way to go forward, but they could do with a sort of space that collates, that builds cohorts, if you like, supports them in this sort of thing. And then government policy in all kinds of ways. We can pick up on some of those as we go forward.
This is probably where I want to go next. You know, when I think about a creative space, right? If you think of, let's say, music, right? If you do music, you can focus on the local internal market, but you can also export because there's a huge demand for it. And what it takes to export your music, not as much. Well, I hope I'm not talking out of this, but maybe not as much as if you were in fashion, for instance.
Yeah.
The value chain for fashion is like all over the place, so many issues, blah, blah. A few years ago, I know that Louis Vuitton, I think, wanted to do a line with Nigerian designs and really wanted to work with Nigerian designers, but couldn't get capacity, right? So when I think about fashion and the growing local demand, sorry, I'm not wearing mine, but the growing local demand for it, how come we haven't kind of leveraged that a lot to do more? If I look at places like Indonesia, India, etc., that's what everybody wears. So huge local market. But if I wanted to buy stuff today, I have to call my tailor or go to my tailor. I can't just buy it off the rack. So what are some of those issues that have limited the growth of the fashion space, like we see in other places?
Fantastic point there. I'll touch briefly on what you said about exporting and things. Trade facilitation is another huge challenge that those we spoke to had mentioned, both in terms of importing the raw materials they need, but also trying to get the goods they want to get out. But they're so innovative, the way they engage technology platforms to sell what they need to sell and all of that. So really fascinating. Some of the challenges moving through domestic markets. Of course, one is we're talking of, they're very segmented markets. Some of those, depending on what level you're talking about, designers, they are targeting a particular group, but I think there's enough to go around. I don't even think that's the issue. You have designers catering to a whole range of markets. Now, a great point you make. We have a film on creative women entrepreneurs in Lagos, where as a fashion designer, it's Wembasi who speaks precisely to this point you make about having to, there's so many, and again, it's a form of innovation. So in some ways, it links to what I said before about the need for support on innovation, on trial and error, and the kind of sunk costs that come with it. Because a challenge you noted is there's so much learning that a small firm has to do by themselves, right? Those are costs that if there's more support for the sector as a whole, there's a place to go to get the kind of collective experience. That means that not every firm has to deal with that. Precisely on this point about ready to wear, like they were trying to test the market around ready to wear, trying to understand would people want that, but people tend to, so yes, people want ready to wear, but we're also very spoiled and very used to, I bought it off the rack, but I can ask my tailor to just fix it. Why can't you fix it? So we also need to, and these are some of the tensions that we want something that's authentic. We want to think about African markets, but at the same time, we we have to think through how, yes, we use some of these approaches that allow us to be more straightforward, but we have to adapt to that. Our market is our market. We can't manufacture another market. Our market is our market. How do we adapt all these learnings, all these ideas to that local market? How do we co-create, right? How do we recognize what we have? And we see a lot of success with that kind of approach when you think of the leadership of fashion designers in spaces of sustainability, for example, right? Because we have ways of doing things that are far ahead of what is going on in other parts of the world. So I talk about fashion, we're celebrating it, but it is, I think, the second largest polluter globally after the fossil fuels sort of mineral spaces, right? And there's so many innovations coming. I get so annoyed when people say, how do we teach? How do we teach sustainability to these folks? I mean, there are now fancy terms like slow fashion, like made to measure, like small batch production. I mean, these are things anyone, if you grew up in this spaces, that is how we've always done things. And for me, what is key is that we own that space, right? We put whatever label we have to put on it. We have to get those terms, we have to own it and not let people come and tell us, what sustainability looks like. Of course, it's a global space, there's lots to learn, but, we have to own what we know. And we, this agency, we have what to teach. I think we have to believe we have what to teach and think about the structures for doing that as well.
And so again, there's this question I'm not able to answer, or maybe I have the answer, but it's, finding where it falls on the spectrum. You look at Nollywood, right? And Nollywood did not wait for government to grow, right? So people saw, and I've heard so many stories and myths about this, I don't know which to believe, but let's say that they found a space, they found a market, they started shooting it with home videos, and it took off. Music, I grew up in a time when some of the musicians, and I'm not going to name any names, wanted to sound like Michael Jackson, and they couldn't break through. But you've got people who speak street, and we can't get enough of it, right? And again, governments, you can't quite see government's involvement in any of these two. So one is tempted to say that we should move without government, but I also see the tech space and what's happening in the Yaba corridor. Realize that if the government did not lay the fiber that went through Yaba, many of the unicorns we have today may not be there. So how do we balance this out? How do we balance the need for working with government to do what it needs to do, but also realizing that government is not in a hurry to do what it needs to do and the people need to move? How do we balance this out?
Absolutely. I think that's a really, really important question. And I think you've part answered it yourself, as you said. I mean, they've done it, actually. They have not waited. They've carried on. But I remember, I believe it was under Jonathan, there was a film fund. There have been little bits here and there, but not nearly enough. I think that dynamism has been critical, what you say about music. And for me, again, is that articulation, is that focus on your space, is that value in yourself and your own community as an important market. And that has taken them very, very far. It is using technology, platforms that are not Nigerian-owned per se, but redeploying that to certain uses. However, listening, I think I read something recently about Spotify and how little of any of those resources go actually to the musicians. I mean, it makes for sore reading. And there you see, and I think this question about government becomes very important there, because I think Spotify is a Swedish firm. So we have our Nigerian musicians strengthening the Swedish economy, right? So yes, they're not, they're doing things themselves. You see, with capitalist production and extraction, someone is always creaming the surplus. Someone is always creaming that surplus. And how do we look after our ecosystem to pay attention to that? What you said, indeed, about the investment in infrastructure in Yaba and what that means. So I think quite often we struggle to and also there's a I think, what's the term? There's a burden of statehood. And this is linked to structural adjustment programs. There's an antithesis. The state is horrible. Everything's private sector. that we've inherited, and we don't. But actually, the most successful have relied I said it before about tech industry, the Apple and all of that, Samsung, very heavily linked to state investment. If you think of, so let's take an example, another creative economy, K-pop. Because I looked at South Korea as a developmental state, very heavy engagement with state capital in that space. And look at how stratospheric that has been. It's not, of course, it's always a complicated relationship between the state and the market, but it plays a very crucial, absolutely crucial role. You think of questions. So for example, I think a key example to note, for instance, is in the music industry. I think we heard recently of some foundational record companies. I don't quite understand what was being sold, whether it's the company itself or it's right. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I think so. Exactly. And I think I've heard AfroEximbank being AfroEximbank, of course, offers a very extensive finance through its KNEX program, and really facilitating access to finance. And I remember hearing some, these are the kinds of things they want to slow down, because there is something about a foundational actor in this country, and you can't blame them, right? And what you said, they've done it without the state, just striven, and they're at a place where now it's, listen, I want to rest. I can't keep this. I need to live, and I get that. But the onus is on the state to think very carefully about this as a well, right? It is not just about the economic value, it is a cultural value. What you said about the use, I think the use of language, the poetics of Afrobeats, the decolonization of language, the way in which it challenges what you said about, nobody cares about sounding American anymore, and creating new language, new ways of communicating that people around, there's a hungry global African diaspora that it wants to learn all of this. And this is about now our leadership in this space. People talk about soft power and always hesitant about this term, but the influence that all of this has. So I think it is this impetus on the state to think in very critical ways about what it's risking letting go of. If it doesn't take this space absolutely critical, and what is letting go, what is giving to people. The other point I want to make is about technology, right? So one thing is, yes, we keep using these platforms, and they will, all of us do. But there needs to be a very serious conversation about who owns data, about who is extracting the surplus. Because we're going to come to very complicated conversations now about intellectual property that seem to be on the back burner now. In the UK, very complicated conversations because of the use of AI and the rights that AI companies will have to just use the material for others. There's a pushback in the UK. I mean, if they're going to get that here, imagine the absorption of all what our creatives are doing on the continent. I think that kind of conversation, we cannot expect creatives to be doing that. They can't make the work and do that. We have to think of those power relations. Who is supposed to do that? That has to fall with the state. And I'm excited to see there's a new ministry that has that task, right? But it's not only that ministry's task. It has to be working with tech. So I want to see those kind of collaborative, interdisciplinary conversations about creative spaces as well. It has to be working with finance, industrial production, all of that. But let me pause. I see you have a point to come to.
Yeah. And just to say to the, to the participants audience, use the Q&A tab to put in your questions. We'll get to them in another 2 or 3 minutes, and I'll read them out. I'll give full attribution to whomever puts them in there. But I wanted to understand, what's your challenge with the whole soft power narrative, right? You said that in kind of a passing, but I want to know what your issue is, because, when I look at, say, food, right? So I like some Chinese, I like some Indian, like, every other person. But I suspect that when I finally get to India, that it's not going to be the Indian food I know, right? And I see that happening to Nigerian food. 2 weeks ago, I was at a restaurant, in DC that pretends to be Nigerian. And I checked out some of the cuisine. Okay, so Nigerian influence, but definitely not Nigerian. But there is like a bust of Nigerian, West African restaurants, and every time I kind of pass through, it's mostly white people, right? So I see a bit of soft power on
Yeah.
food, on music, on arts, graphic arts, visual
Yeah.
art, right? In
Absolutely.
fact, my next guest is going to talk about, flourishes, dreams and flourishes
Yeah.
art as a way of growing the economy. So my question is, what's the hesitation, especially given the bad press we have? Shouldn't we be using all of these creative sectors to build a new narrative for Nigeria?
You're right. Let me speak to my hesitation first, and then touch on some of the examples you've noted there. Um, Absolutely. We should. I think and we think of FESTAC in 1977, how that is still celebrated as, such a pivotal moment in the Black world, right? The Black Atlantic, and all of that. So absolutely crucial. At times the state can have a troubling relationship with culture, where it seeks to deploy this to precisely the use it has for it, where it promotes some and doesn't promote some. So that sort of freedom in that space, I guess, is what I'm referring to. Not sure I see a risk of that in Nigeria in this moment, but we know how there are crackdowns in certain moments if folks are saying what certain folks don't want to hear, because they can be quite a vociferous bunch as well. They can speak truth to power. So it's around that yes, certainly they're telling a story about us that we need to be told. Absolutely. But it's to bear in mind that state support and then now demanding certain things is the space sort of nervous about. But what you said about Nigerian restaurants, I thought I just have to say, in London, I think 2 weeks ago, I went to Chishuru, which is now has a Michelin star.
Okay.
And precisely the same. I mean, where I am at King's around the road, there's Ikoyi, another Nigerian, I think that has one or two
It
Michelin stars.
pretends to be West African.
Tends to be West African, and always this Nigerian dominance, which causes other problems for our African sisters and brothers. And so I think you're absolutely right. What you said about visual art. I read about an artist this weekend, Marcella. I can't remember her name, in the Financial Times. Her work being celebrated in there. Was not the first time her work is being there. This is someone who was trained in Nigeria, and I think these are the points. When I say we have a lot of challenges, but we need to also be honest about what is beautiful about about these spaces, Nigeria and other African spaces. I myself, I went to Federal Government Girls College, Shagamu. A lot of my friends that went to those spaces as well. We had an education that was almost free in those spaces. Think of the movement. I think Nigeria is the fourth largest contributor to, maybe fourth, fifth, sixth, to the National Health Service. A lot of those people trained in Nigeria. So, and this is the state as well, right? So a lot of challenges, but there are a lot of things that we need to pay heed to as well, and think about what we are benefited that others behind us have been unable to, and what is our responsibility to that space as a result of that. I think the naysaying, we have to do better. We have to do more than that. What is our own role going to be in shifting the conversation away from woe is me and everything is awful to, and I like the question you put to me at the ALC, what are you folks doing? How are you thinking about what you can offer, and the work we're doing at the Africa Public Square? Don't come and just pose questions and challenge and argue. What are you suggesting we do to move things forward, I think.
And there's this concept of, and I think it came up in our prior conversation about, just focusing on the local market, way of driving innovation, etc. In my mind, I'm thinking about it like FUBU, for by us, and just leveraging that to drive a lot of innovation and then break into international markets, but also having the local market. To what extent, or where are we in that today in the industry? And what else? What do we need to add to it, to do better? Or who else should we be talking to or partnering with to ensure that we grow these industries?
Yeah, no, again, really, really good point. Absolutely, for us by us. I mean, the point I'd made about these Jubilee syringes, for example, thinking about what are the things we need. And so that Jubilee syringes in Akwa Ibom was interested in local markets, in Nigerian markets. So I think they even managed to get through a legislation that made it necessary for state-funded hospitals, state-run public hospitals to use Nigerian-made syringes, a form of industrial policy, which some people are happy with, some people are less happy with. I tend to think it has its place, and we need these things. So you have policies like that, but I want to note something, because I said I've been doing some work, still needs to yet to come out around vaccine production and some of these conversations about the state. And what happened during COVID? I mean, it was very interesting engaging with different scientists who were it was very refreshing as well. How they said, actually, we need to take ourselves seriously. We need to take our innovation this is where, scientists, we need to take our innovation really, really seriously. They're power hierarchies in knowledge in scientific spaces who decide what is true knowledge, what is true science, and what isn't, right? That we always have to contend. But it's something that really struck me that was said in some of those conversations was how, because of the way there was a different reaction to COVID, to the pandemic in West Africa, where you had, of course, very extensive mortality that many of us are still reeling from, but you had far lower levels of mortality than you had in many other parts of the world. That there was potentially something about that context and about that space that further investigation, further engagement with forms of science might have unearthed, right? That would let us think, if you think about vaccine development in a space like that, could lead to newer kinds of outcomes, newer goods that probably didn't exist anywhere else. We would be the ones generating something that doesn't exist anywhere else. Another more joyful example is I went to Accra, and this amazing, I don't remember the name now, chocolate place, where I had a chocolate that had gari and groundnut in it. A luxury chocolate, absolutely fascinating. But I think the key point there is this is a form of chocolate only West Africans could have put together. Only West Africans would have done that. So let's use these points to think about what the world is not getting.
Exactly.
If we spend all our time importing things and not thinking, not just so, I don't want to say, oh, domestic market and be autarkic about it. Yes, but it's also about what kind of innovation will be possible that will serve us, but serve the globe as a whole. Everyone is looking for new ideas. Everyone is looking for something promising, innovative, that offers, new way of thinking, new spaces. I think Afrobeats is offering that, for example.
Afrobeats, the film industry. I mean, it's
the film industry, absolutely,
amazing.
absolutely.
It's incredible. I mean, I don't watch that much, but it's incredible how people respond to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in the past, you introduce yourself as Nigerian, and maybe they'll ask you about JJ Okocha or Kanu Wankwo. Now people talk about Nollywood actors.
Yeah,
actresses.
absolutely.
I have to pretend I know them. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so let's let me come a bit, lift this a little bit to economics as a discipline. Yeah. And what are your thoughts on the way we've engaged with our economic policies, right? So, and this is a struggle I have between understanding how to think about it within the Africa context.
Yeah.
Should we be pushing state-led interventions? Given the size of or the enormity of the challenges that we're facing, should we be thinking about market-led solutions, mindful of the risks of capitalism, etc.?
Yeah.
Where do we fall on that spectrum?
Yeah, no, thank you. I think it's a good point, and this has been, this is the kind of work I've been engaged with for much of my professional life. This conversation about the state, this complexity about state market interactions. I mean, I think we're not in a neutral space if we think of economics in general. So often we treat the idea of market leadership, market fundamentalism as the norm, and a state playing a critical role is an aberration. Now, coming into a place where the market is the dominant actor is also an ideological position. It is not a sort of neutral norm, no. So any side of this conversation is you're on an ideological spectrum. I'm on an ideological spectrum that suggests that because we live in a world where there are global political economy hierarchies, because there are dependencies that are not purely our doing. There are dependencies that are linked to our histories. There are dependencies that are linked to coloniality. There can never be a level playing field for us to say all private sector actors should go there and may the best person win. I don't think that can exist. I think states play a critical role, but of course, the big question we ask when we think of states on the African continent is what about the capacities to play that role? So one thing, states should play a critical role, but the capacity to play a role that is meaningful and that is valuable becomes a very key follow-up question, which of course is important. If I think of Nigeria now and reflect a little bit on some recent policies, they remember the removal of the fuel subsidies, devaluation of the Naira, for example. Those are policies that, of course, lean very much to sort of neoliberal school of thought. We need to, level the playing field. We need to make things nice for private sector actors. That's where we need to go. But I think we will agree that the result of that has been troubling, has been challenging. You devalue currencies and you're import dependent not just for luxuries, but for essential goods. People are in penury as a result. So for me, my bigger concern is, why are we doing what we're doing? Are we doing it because this is good behavior or bad behavior? Or are we taking a long, hard look at our context and saying, what is it that we need in this space? Because there are a lot of contradictions around this dichotomy between the state and the market. A huge example is thinking of Dangote. And of course, we will point to this as a celebration of the private sector. It's fantastic. Look at the success that happens when you allow private sectors to thrive and move. And yes, of course, I think it's something to celebrate when we think that Nigeria, from being a core importer of cement, is core exporter, the largest, I think might be the largest producer, or at least one of the largest. And Nigeria itself is a source of foreign direct investment to other parts of the African continent. You see engagement. So, and I like this because there's a lot of attention to actually, we need this. This is helping the construction industry instead of importing. So you're dealing with a need, but you're also exporting. You're using local raw materials. So what we said before, coming away from exporting limestone, you're actually value adding, thinking of value chains. So it's doing the things we want to see and the things we want to hear, right? But we know that a lot of that is linked to particular relationships between Dangote, or at least the firm, and the political class. And it's not unique in that. Across the world, you have that. If you look at the histories of Samsung, anywhere you go. So these are myths. The idea that these are distinct and absolutely separate places that fit particular ideological positionings, right? In here where I'm located, during COVID, it was like, oh, the pharma companies, the work they've done to develop a COVID vaccine, I think it was AstraZeneca, that was funded to the tune of, I think, 93 or 97% by the British state. Okay, so these very complicated interactions we're talking about, I think what we need to center is actually, is what we need value addition on our raw materials that leads to this, leads to that. Who are all those that need to come together to get us where we need to go? Don't forget, of course, Dangote as a firm benefited from a backward integration policy under Obasanjo that meant protectionism, that meant the enjoyed forms of monopoly that have really served to lead to that space. And so for me, another layer of this question is, yes, the thriving like that, what responsibility do private sector actors have to their populace? What is happening to those profits? What is happening to corporate tax? Because if we say, that's the other point, when you say you want to focus on domestic markets, of course, a valid response to that is, but what domestic markets? Who is going to be able to buy those things? Look at the levels of poverty within that market. Right? So I think the onus is also on the state. Of course, we know it's on the state, but also on private sector actors to think which market is going to buy these things. What does that mean for the wages? So instead of the complaints about minimum wage, I mean, come on. We should be saying, well, if I were paying minimum wage like this to people, how are they supposed to buy these goods? And so that challenges us in the kind of standard or classic narratives about trickle-down economics. It means we have to vision how we think about economics in other ways. It can't just be, I'm going to make my goods, take it to the market, and let's see who buys it.
Exactly.
Because we're in Nigeria, because we're in Africa, private sector too should be thinking, what are people getting paid? Right? We should also be challenging government. How is this going to work? And those are not conversations I think we have enough. And those are we should have a new way of thinking about economics, right? That takes, and this is again back to what Claude Ake had said, right? We have to move away from production by the many for the few. How are we going to do that? Yeah.
And I'm tempted to ask a question on minimum wage to get your view on it, but I'm going to walk away from that and take some questions from the audience.
Thank you.
I've got one from Etemore Glover. She's the CEO of National Advisory Board on Impact Investing. And her question is, I'm wondering why African governments are not responding quickly to the current geopolitical trends, populist movements, which is resulting in cutting back on funds, saying aid, etc. Instead of these governments looking inwards and exploring maybe South-South collaborations or just fast tracking after, they tend to see, or we tend to see a shift in them looking towards the East for salvation. How do we address this problem? And maybe in giving your response, maybe you speak to this thought I have about just a lack of faith or pride in ourselves. We can solve this problem, and it tends to get us to look outwards to say who's there to help us. But I'm interested in your views.
No, thank you. Thank you for that question. I think it's really important. It's interesting. I had to speak somewhere recently, and this question of in this moment, what's going on in the continent. I've been intrigued to see, maybe not from government, but from many who there's been panic, of course, and you can understand that if loads of programs are ending because of this ODA cuts, but a lot of self-reliance responses after the shock, actually we have to find a way to be doing this ourselves. I think the Nigerian government, I think it might have, I read somewhere, pledged some $200 million. I don't know if that's correct, to fill a gap. It's a pledge. I don't know what that means. And it was absorbing some staff and things like that. That suggests some pointing to this self-reliance conversation. So to this question, I think there is what we've been discussing before, something about the collective. This is not a Nigeria only problem. This is this point about Africa as a whole. I think this is a moment of reckoning to say we had COVID a few years ago where we said, look at where we've been left. We tried to argue for intellectual property rights waivers so we can produce these vaccines, and our friends told us, no, we will produce them and give you what we like, give you expired medication, whatever. And we tried to do that. And here we are 4 or 5 years later. Again, another layer. And, this, oh no, what is happening? It's a moment for us. I mean, and don't get me wrong, I'm a student of coloniality, right? I think a lot of our challenges, yes, we cause some, but many are not. Many are the way the world is structured, and it's deliberate. It's not accidental. It's not just simply what we do. We are swimming against the tide. Every time we try to do something else, we are swimming against the tide. We cannot do that alone. And what you said about convening, for us to say, how will we chart this together? I think there's something about the collective. So what you said about looking east, that looking east, if they gather all of you, Mali, Nigeria, all of you come 1-1-1, no, that conversation will look different if it is a collective response, because, we need the hegemonies of finance. If there's some resources, we need some technologies, let's negotiate getting them, but let's think of the power. Let's think of the power around that. But let's value ourselves in doing that and recognize we bring something to the table. We're in a period where we're talking about critical minerals. So they finished, well, they're not finished, still fuel, still all that. Now another one. We cannot find ourselves in the same space as before. It will be difficult to blame other people if we find ourselves there again, I think.
So I have a question from Rosalind Anya Okorie. She just started with us at Nextier as a youth. And she says, oh, thanks for your insight. This discourse has been incredibly enlightening. My question is about fashion. Given the role in cultural identity and economic growth, how do you think the state can better support archival and sustainable fashion as part of the creative economy? Specifically, what policies or initiatives could help preserve heritage,
Yeah.
promote local production, and
Yeah.
reduce reliance on second-hand imports?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the state's role in
Mm.
advancing archival fashion in Nigeria? Do you
Yeah.
think archival in this sense is important from a broad economic perspective?
Yeah. Thank you. I think that is a truly fascinating and important question. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think so. There's something about the fashion, about the items, about the flash, the beauty, but there is something about what it means for knowledge. What it means, especially in our spaces where, you know, some people will say African spaces, many spaces in parts of the global south have suffered what is termed an epistemicide, where the knowledges we have of our spaces are for somewhere else, narratives about the dark continent and all of that. And we need to think of multidimensional knowledges, not just the papers we write. We know there are politics around what gets published, what doesn't, which ideas rise to the top. But these are hugely important forms of knowledge. I was in here 2 years ago, there's the Africa Fashion Exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum. I mean, those holdings, the stories that were told around that, they're not just stories, the knowledge about Africa, not just on fashion. It spoke about the independence movement. It spoke about how creatives were speaking back, spoke about technology, spoke about markets, spoke about agency, influence, sustainability. So I think there is a lot of work, and here I think is the work of research. Here is where, you know, we need to see those intersections between the state, government, private sector, and you know, knowledge creators, academics. What is going on? This sort of trilateral conversation there. You know, we know that you know what you're saying. You know, this soft power conversation. Lots of interest in our spaces, in our continent. Who is, and this is the point about intellectual property rights. This is the point about selling off record companies. Really, to me, these are very critical points. What holdings are there going to be? What kind of museums do we need to see? Digital archives for this material, I think, is absolutely, absolutely critical. There are all these, and you know, I don't know, these younger folks that have been brought into the creative spaces. I know they had several of the parastatals as well.
Yes.
This is the work they should be doing. This
Mhm.
is the role of the state. This is the, so yes, they're gathering. I mean, I think I've seen a couple of things of gathering folks, but we have to think, when I've left this position, what will people point to and say I did? And I think precisely this kind of archival projects is the sort of thing you leave for posterity, that you say, that you'll point to a person, that person was there 20 years ago, their time there, look at what came out of it. Critical point. And what you say about sustainability as well, you know, I've written a bit with colleagues, co-written about these issues as well. There is so much we hold, so much knowledge we hold, that we should be teaching others. If we don't note it somehow, and we could say write, but not just write, film, whatever ways, note it down. I mean, this documentary we had, Chief Nike, who works on Adire Textiles in Lagos. If you listen to what she had to say about Adire, this was chemistry, scientific knowledge about the procedure of doing this, how she did it in other places. She had to use an electric blanket, think of the temperatures. This should be in a chemistry class, but we won't have that information unless it is stored, noted for us before others. What you said about confidence in ourselves, these are exercises in confidence in ourselves. Yeah.
And I watched the video on YouTube. I can't remember the title now. The video you speak about, the Nike video.
Yes, creative women entrepreneurs in Lagos.
Fantastic. It's a brilliant documentary.
Yeah.
She spoke about how, you know, she's the 5th generation, you know, doing
Exactly.
stuff. I mean, it's really fascinating. But I've got a question from Jonathan Sandy. He says, Professor Eka, as always, thank you so much for your stressing the significant potential of the creative economy like music, film, art, and fashion. Holds for stimulating economic growth and development, not only for Nigeria, but for citizens of the entire continent. That said, writing from Ouagadougou, my question is, how can African states emerging from post-conflict, fragile or in political transition, leverage the creative economy to step up domestic revenue mobilization as a means of reducing the dependence of humanitarian and development aid, as we all know, have serious implications for long-term sustainability of peace processes?
This is a brilliant question, and this is a dear, dear senior colleague of mine. I am delighted to see you here, Jonathan. It's been too long. Thank you so much for this question, and it's poignant. We work with the NEEM Foundation in northeastern Nigeria. In fact, trying to put together a project that is addressing this. So they do, because on my other hat, I do work on, and where I've met him as well, where we've worked together, in fact, on peace building and reconstruction and development. They do work on providing psychosocial support, including using creative methods, such as creating textiles, stitching, embroidery, weaving fans, theater, dance, as well as both an intervention in sort of a mental health intervention, but also as a peace building intervention, where the repetitive acts help with dealing with anxiety, but also the weaving work they do produces peace messaging. And we are actually trying to put together a project that would connect that hugely innovative work in northeastern Nigeria to the work we've been doing with fashion designers in Lagos. Because we agree with you entirely. So both, we know that in mental health discourses, those that live in sort of very debilitating situations of poverty suffer higher levels of mental health. We also know the relationship between poverty and violent conflict in my own work and violent extremism. So really, there's unfortunately this collective of these challenges. Quite often the problem, as you've rightly noted, is how do we connect those to dealing with economic livelihoods as well? Because we know people will face mental health challenges if they are worried about what they're going to eat and what they're going to do. You are so right. And my hope is we get the support to do this. But in the work we did around preparing that proposal, it was very clear that this is a huge gap. We know those things are connected, but very few actually try to bring them together and build them together. And what you say, I mean, we know what's happening with overseas development assistance in this moment. We're going to have less and less. We hosted the commissioner for the UNHCR at King's last week, and he was saying this. They are funded, the majority funder is USAID, the US government. So they're going to be less and less funds to support this kind of activities, and we have to think quickly on the ground. So that is one example of how we've done this. Their work spreads to the Sahel as well. So we would love to, the idea is it's a pilot study to see how this works, but to certainly think of how we can connect this to other realities. It may mean that such an intervention, of course, would look very different in different spaces, but it's a fantastic question that we're actually trying to speak to. So Jonathan, it would be lovely to interact with you around that as well, please. And thank you for being here so much.
Okay, so I have a question from Dr. Ndumokolo. He's a partner with Nextier. He says, it's great to hear you discussing issues that affect Africa. You mentioned the structural adjustment program as one of the major causes of setback for the continent. While I acknowledge this perspective, I'd like to know how you view the role and character of the African states in this context, especially considering its developed nature. It's worth noting that SAP has proven effective in other environments as well.
Thank you. I think, yeah, thank you very much for that. I think that is, a valid response to my point. Yes, and I think that the last element of your statement, I think, is also based on evidence. We see that it caused us a lot of hardship and a lot of problem. The character of the state is an important point to note as well, because there is a tendency of many of us who are also on the heterodox space that thinking about development to blame the international finance institutions. It's them, they did it, they caused it, they did it. But I draw on the work of Professor Adebayo Adedeji, who headed the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, who actually, and it builds on the work of Frantz Fanon, Claude Ake, who said actually the people he holds responsible for all of this are the occupants of the state, because it's sort of selling those in the country down the river to secure their spaces. Let's recall that for many of these states, these were military authoritarian regimes. These were opportunities to negotiate acceptance into the global political economy. In fact, the World Bank at the time had noted, I can't remember who it was, like the name escapes me, I teach about this, but I can't remember the exact name, but there is a quote of one of the actors in that space saying, actually, there's almost a good fortune that these are military dictators who will ensure that these policies are put in place. So there's one. This principle of liberal democracy, of course, was not so central at the time. But also the dissonance between those two things, right? There's certain policies that are supposed to restrict market forces, but actually they have to be forced by the state in that space, right? And the outcome of a lot of that, I think the theoretical foundations of some of these, we're not speaking to African context. You say want to devalue currencies. I mean, devaluing currencies, as I said before, in import-dependent contexts, the outcome we get, as we're getting in Nigeria today, these are not actual surprises. It worked in Indonesia as another space I've looked at, where there was a negotiated engagement with the structural adjustment program. Of course, it was in a stronger position. It was on the cusp of industrial development in a way that many countries in the African context were not, right? So there are certain aspects that, you know, spoke to them, sort of thinking about balancing budgets, but there are certain aspects there that they didn't take on board because they read those as inimical to what was going on. Let's remember that in many African contexts at the time, there's also something about the timing. These were spaces that had taken up very extensive finance, often problematically from commercial sources, to drive, in some cases, yes, there was corruption, but in large cases, this was about heavy infrastructural expenditure. Infrastructure costs money. And in a sense, now the upset we have with thinking about China and debt is that those trains, when I look at trains in Lagos, I cannot believe this is the city of my birth. But that costs very, very heavy capital outlays. So either, as the World Bank has said, if we can't afford it, we shouldn't have those trains. That's what we were being told. Yeah, you have those trains if you can afford it. I live in the UK, they can't afford this too. Yeah, but here you borrowed because people need the train. Okay, and so for me, I think it's part of the challenge also, and it's a challenge that's continued up until now. Is the point I made before. Why are we doing what we're doing? These policy sets, to what extent are they speaking to the particular needs of these contexts? They were not speaking to our particular needs. These were blanket statements that were ideological, that were saying you have to do this, 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 and this. And when they don't work, the point is, well, you didn't do them well enough. Okay, so that's my own position on this. Yes, the states have huge challenges. After all, we did have state-led development approaches prior to that were problematic. And I've worked on this, where there was a drive for industrial development, but there was a neglect of the broadest base of the population. So you see investment in agriculture that focused on, in the 70s, focused on large-scale agriculture, not on the majority small scale. And that speaks to that production by the many for the few. Who is the center?
We've got maybe 90 seconds to go. And I'd like to get into this, your view on the minimum wage. I just can't let it go. You know, what's your view on minimum wage and the way we've done it and the way maybe we should be thinking about it? And maybe if there's any question I didn't get to that you want to address in 90
Sorry, I haven't had a good look at the questions just yet, but on the minimum wage, I mean, my point is quite simple and straightforward, and maybe less of an economist's point. I remember being, I think, at some meeting last year. I can't remember if it was there's a business magazine in Nigeria. I can't remember what they're called. It was in Lagos, and attended their meeting where there were these conversations amongst the private CEOs. There were CEOs there. My brother works in some of these spaces. And there were a lot of debates and conversations about where we're going, the future. And there's a question I wanted to put to them. There's a room full of CEOs around the minimum wage. You know, where there are all these conversations about how Nigeria should move forward, where we should go, and no reflection on those who are supposed to consume these products. Instead, complaints about the level of the minimum wage. And I think it's hugely problematic. Nigeria is not the UK, the US, it's not these places. And precisely for that reason, You know, we have some of the highest levels of poverty globally. We can't talk about the functioning of our economies without thinking of what kind of markets are there, without thinking of people's earnings, without raising questions of equity. If we're thinking of sustained transformation, where will that come from? Where is that supposed to come from? We live in a world now, and by the way, a place like China, every time there's crisis on the global market, you know what they do? They return to their domestic market. That is and Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, their beginnings were our domestic market. They turn to it. Trump's panic, and I'm not advocating that is a source of advice or wisdom at all. We must do that, I think. And so for me, we shouldn't be contending this amount of money for minimum wage. Honestly, I think the private, and of course, bear with me, the private sector is also very segregated. Of course, there are certain elements that will struggle with this, and of course, we should have some conversations and questions around that. But there are huge elements of the private sector that should really not even be raising this as an issue, especially given what has happened with inflation recently. They should be offering more. I think if they're serious, not for generosity, but if they're serious about development. Thank you.
Professor Eka, thank you so much for a very fascinating conversation. I'm not sure we covered everything, so I'll be coming back to you. We've got to do this again, yeah? But to everyone, this time in 2 weeks' time, April 9th, I'll have a very good friend of mine, Professor Jeff Castellotti. He works with the Pan-African University and is the curator at the Yemisi Shilo Museum in the university. And he'll be speaking on dreams and flourishes, art as catalyst for change. You know, so please join us. But Eka, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much to you, to everyone. Beautiful questions. I'm so sorry I didn't get to any of them, but I take them with me and we'll keep pondering them. Thank you, and to the Nextier team for hosting me. I'm so grateful. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, and have a great day.